And with that, I would love to introduce Rajon. So I know Rajon for a very, very long time. Like I said, partners in crime in a couple of meetups. Rajon had his own meetup. We started TechLearn way back, which morphed into TechKnowCon and so on. So, and then we collaborated and worked together while he was at LinkedIn. And most recently, Rajon is at Splunk. Is very passionate about measuring the impact of learning. There are a couple of articles and interviews I've done with him over the years from his learnings at LinkedIn, and now he's got new insights being in Splunk. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Rajon. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Marco. Bear with me 1 second as I share my screen. So yeah, that was a great summary of the community. Thank you so much, Marco, and thank you everyone for attending today. So since we are a community, I would like to ask very briefly for any of the hiring managers here on this call to just raise your hand in raise the raise hand icon if you're hiring, just briefly, and if you are hiring. For those of you that are looking for opportunities, please pay attention and reach out to these folks so that you can find better opportunities. So thank you so much, everyone. All right, so thanks for joining. As Marco mentioned, I recently joined Splunk as the director of their engineering enablement and engagement team. So, we're responsible for things like technical onboarding of engineers, technical learning, internal documentation, knowledge sharing, and, things related to that matter. Prior to Splunk, I actually worked at LinkedIn for 9 years. And during that time, I founded LinkedIn's technical training team and also led their technical documentation team, as well as a small but mighty team of software engineers focused on developing knowledge tools and data collection tools that measures knowledge gaps. Before I continue with this talk, I would like to ask everyone a question here. So one thing I believe is that training is one of the most expensive business solutions. But why is that? So everyone attending here today, please in the chat, guess why training and learning might be one of the most expensive business solutions. So I'll give everyone like probably a couple minutes, just write in the chat why you think it might be. Okay, we got, what do we have here? Unknown ROI. We're looking for cash back on their investments. Scaling can be costly. Yep. Bundled platform packages. Lots of unknowns. Okay, cool, awesome. So yes, a lot of those are reasons why it is costly. But beyond the upfront cost of putting together learning systems, training, there's the sunk cost of people's time. And having our employees attend hours of training or complete e-learning or watch videos or read documentation is a high cost to the company. And it becomes even worse if what you're teaching or what you're sharing is actually the wrong thing. And so if you're teaching the wrong things, your programs might actually drive negative impact to the company. And so one key thing to remember is that your primary reason, or the primary reason that your company is investing in you and your team, is to solve a business problem. Yes, we need to design courses or learning experiences, write documentation, but all of those are just means to an end of adding actual business value. So as your programs like grow and evolve, and there'll come a time where your leadership will question what kind of value you're adding to the business, and they want to know what kind of if they're making the right investment or not. So in this talk, I'll walk you through practical ways that you can demonstrate value and impact to make those types of conversations a lot easier. So I want to set the right expectations, all right? Every single company is different. So the types of value that each company is looking for is different. Some companies are looking for employee happiness, others are looking for productivity and efficiency, and others might be looking for hard dollar value or cost savings. I cannot tell you silver bullet metrics that'll make you successful in your company. But what I can share is practical methods that'll help you identify how you can measure so that it aligns with your company's expectations. So the concepts that I'll share in this talk will be based on the experiences that I've had in my 9-year tenure at LinkedIn. And I found it extremely helpful. And I'd like to set the right context too. So all of the learning solutions in my role has been mostly around improving engineering productivity and efficiency by closing knowledge gaps. So unfortunately, I won't have a lot of examples for things like required training or compliance training or soft skills or other domains. But for those of you that are in other domains, you might be able to interpret some of the concepts that I share into those areas. Okay, so why is measurement important? So the number one reason it's important is because it holds you and your company accountable for the value that you provide your company. So if you are the first person or only person responsible for technical learning at your company, your leaders won't know how to measure what you do. They will leave it up to you to tell them how it's going to be measured. It also helps you understand your audience's pain points and helps you prioritize what to focus on. So traditionally, like learning, training, documentation teams, for lack of a better term, those teams have more or less kind of been order takers. So requirements come from above, from management or stakeholders, and you just go ahead and execute. And prioritization of your projects are usually driven by either opinion or which stakeholders are the loudest. Yeah, there are times where you have to do things like you got to train people to adapt to a new system, things like that. But having the right metrics puts you in a strategic position to help lead the conversation and help make your decisions be more data driven. So it helps when your programs need improvements. So gathering the right metrics knows whether or not your programs need to be changed, and it empowers you to deliver things more iteratively and leave room for experimentation. And it also builds trust with leadership, knowing that you're able to provide evidence of actual business value. All right. So a lot of the concepts I'm going to share in this talk will be based on the scientific method. The scientific method is actually what heavily influenced things like agile software development practices, or like MVP concepts from lean startup or design thinking, or even instructional design. And it's actually a catalyst for innovation. But most of the time in our world, we are so quick to skip those top steps and jump quickly to prediction and experimentation. But often we forget to think, like, what does success actually look like from a business perspective? So in business terms, success or results, that last part, should be quantified so that if you're making things better or worse. So the typical scenario is that people kind of skip these steps. They rush right to prediction and experimentation, which is why the typical metrics being used for programs are things like attendance and smile sheets. Because sometimes, we're excited and we want to jump into actual problem solving. that sometimes we lose sight of what problems we're really solving for. So ideally, before you start a project or before you start a program, you would want to measure first. So I know sometimes it seems impossible and you might be pressured to start with execution, but skipping the first few steps like actually prevents you from being success or measuring what's successful. And there are inexpensive ways to measure if you're on a budget. So for example, recently I joined Splunk. I actually made the hard decision to push back in implementing solutions immediately to make sure that we actually leave time to begin measuring. And it's only now that we have real insight that we're able to craft the right strategy and implement the right programs. So it's good to have baselines and know what your starting points are. So I'm gonna walk through 4 different types of measurements. And I just want to reiterate, a lot of this is in the context of technical learning and learning for software engineers, because that's been my experience. I'm a huge fan of Kirkpatrick levels of evaluation. However, I've learned not to be so dogmatic about that feedback, about that framework, because a lot of projects that I've done haven't used all of those levels. So I've adapted what I've learned from Kirkpatrick and kind of created my own levels. So let's walk through each of them. The first 2 types that you see above, they should look really familiar. The first classification is for usage and adoption. Understanding if people are actually using what you've built or attending the programs that you've designed. Second is acceptance. So, do people think that your program satisfies their needs? And this is typically measured by smile sheets. Next one on the bottom is application. So this is actually Kirkpatrick level 3. Are people actually using the skills and knowledge that they gain on the job? And the last value is impact. How does your program impact the business as a whole? So the first 2 above can be viewed as tactical metrics. So this data is easy to collect, it's inexpensive to collect, and it's immediately actionable. So, and the latter 2 are more strategic, which means it's harder to collect the data and it takes a longer time to observe those changes. But it's the strategic metrics where you can truly derive business value. Tactical metrics are you can take action almost immediately. One important thing to note is that, if you decide to gather strategic metrics through surveys, there will always be a lagging indicator. So that means you most likely will find results 2 or more quarters after you start collecting your data. And it's mostly because change of perception and change of behavior is really hard. And for a large organization, it happens over a longer period of time. But one thing that I really would like to stress is that all of these metrics will need to be actionable. So let's dive into each of them. I'm going to give a quick dive before I go over the process. So usage and adoption. So this provides objective information about the usage of a particular solution. So the goal of this metric is to maintain high usage rate and ensure that your target audience is aware and using your solutions. Because if it's not being used, then it won't be effective. So it's good to think about what kind of actions you're going to take if these metrics are trending in the wrong direction. And it's good to think about how you can improve usage and awareness through different types of methods. Right. The next is acceptance. So these metrics provide a signal if what you've implemented has actually gained acceptance or a desirable level from your learners. Many times, people use things such as Net Promoter Score or customer satisfaction score. And I would like to take this time to actually differentiate those two, because I see some teams out there, they love using NPS, and then some teams out there love using a 5-scale Likert scale like CSAT. And so the most effective ways I've seen this being used is to use Net Promoter Score when your target audience has the option not to use the solution provided. So what Net Promoter Score is that it's actually a measure of brand value. So it's used by a lot of marketing teams to make sure that they have a good brand and their products have a good reputation. And it's typically led by survey questions like, how likely are you to recommend? And because it asks that question, how likely are you to recommend? If they're forced to do something or forced to use something, they can't recommend it to other people because other people are forced to use it. So use Net Promoter Score if there's an option not to use what you have. For things like CSAT, conversely, if your learners are required to use the solution, that's where CSAT can make a big, provide really good insights. Okay. Next is application. So this can be both subjective and objective. And it could provide a signal of whether or not knowledge is being applied from the learning, and if it's retained and applied on the job. So it's an early success indicator of the solution. So if you start collecting these metrics and start seeing results, improvements, trying to improve this metric may be larger in scope, and might most likely requires some coordination of an official project rather than some quick changes. And then the last is value and impact. This is actually very similar to Kirkpatrick level 4. So these can be subjective and objective. And so, as I mentioned before, if you gather empirical data or survey, there's typically a lagging indicator of 2 or more quarters. Collecting objective metrics for this can be quite expensive, and by expensive I mean requires a lot of resources to collect. So for example, in the software engineering world, we will need software engineers to actually instrument systems and aggregate that data through dashboards to really understand what the long-term business impact is. All right, so I went through a lot. Anyone have any questions so far? Everyone with me? I'm good. Marco, any questions that I missed on the chat?
There's been some lively conversations, but no specific questions yet.
Okay, cool.
Yeah,
awesome.
I've got one.
So I'll continue on with the next part of this talk, which is really understanding some methods of measuring. All right. So first step. Yep.
I heard somebody start to say, "Hey, I've got one." I don't know who it was.
Okay.
But...
Yeah, that's me. But if you're moving on. Yeah, so my question is, why not? I am experimenting with never asking NPS with feedback, because I heard someone call them vanity metrics once. And ever since they said that, I was like, damn, you're so right. They don't matter. Somebody can love something that's absolutely useless, and somebody can hate something that's exactly what they need. So why not just never ask them, because they're the wrong signal in the first place? Only skip directly to impact, and that's it.
Sure. That's a really good question. So actually, the first 2 metrics, the tactical metrics that I described, are actually vanity metrics. Those are things like usage. Those are things like, acceptance. And I think those 2 are closely related. because you'll want people to be aware and excited for the product that you're, or I'm sorry, the programs that you're actually delivering. So things like, for example, if you're doing something that is not required, you want that word of mouth to happen so that people get excited and want to explicitly and intentionally seek out what you're doing in order to grow adoption and have the right perception for your program. And also, it's a good early signal indicator. As I mentioned, more of the strategic metrics are they do have lagging indicators, so it might take a while to actually to review the more strategic metrics. And I see Chris has his hand up.
Just a quick anecdote. I put the note in the comments, but to elaborate on it a second, somebody had shared with me at one point some research that actually shows a reverse correlation between how much someone likes a training and how much they actually got out of it. And this relates to, learning is hard, right? If you loved the training, you probably weren't pushed to your slightly outside your comfort zone where the learning actually happens. And if you were a little irritated, a little bit like, I didn't like it so much, that's where you're going to actually learn the most. And so again, that's not a universal statement that it's a completely useless thing, but it's an interesting tidbit to sort of say, hey, everybody absolutely loves. Nobody was irritated at all by the training. Maybe that'll show up eventually in your lagging indicators that they didn't actually learn very much because they liked it too much. You didn't push them hard enough. So anyway, that's just an interesting view on the satisfaction.
Exactly. That's a great point you made, Chris. And that's I think we talked about that. If for those of you that joined my talk last year about agile instructional design, we actually spoke about that quite a bit. And training, learning is hard and it's uncomfortable, but it's overcoming some of that discomfort that makes us better at what we do. Cool. So I'll go through the first step, which is analyzing your audience. So you'll want to begin analyzing who your target audience is. For this reason, you'll probably want to partner closely with HR to get this data. And you'd want to segment this data to really understand how your audience is distributed. So how many people are there in your organization? What's your hiring rate? What's your attrition rate that needs to be backfilled? How is your audience distributed amongst different locations around the globe? Are they in the office? Are they remote? How long have they worked at the company? And how can you segment your audience in different cohorts? So when I was at LinkedIn, we had a concept called developer personas. Now at Splunk, we use the term engineering cohorts. And I'll get to that in the next slide. But it's really important to understand, how your audience is segmented, especially in what they do. But it's crucial to actually understanding the data once you collect it. So I'll zoom in on cohorts for right now. So not all engineers have the same needs. So what types of engineers make up your audience? And many times getting this information is not as easy as looking at job titles. For example, many companies have a single job title, which is software engineer or software development engineer. And many of these engineers they complete completely different tasks, work on different tech stacks, and might work on completely different problem spaces. And also, depending on what company you work on or you work for, job titles may be inconsistent across the organization. So my suggestion is to reach out to your tech leads in different teams to help you identify different cohorts. Different projects you engage in require different levels of fidelity. So, it's really up to, what the goal of your project is to understand, how granular you want to get with this type of data. All right. So tenure is another segment I want to focus on. So by getting hire date information from HR, or through your Active Directory service, you can have a good view of how tenure is distributed. So when I was at LinkedIn, for example, we classified tenure in different categories, such as newbies, who are folks that have been at the company less than 1 year, experienced engineers who've been at the company maybe 1 to 3 years, tenured engineers who've been there 4+ years. And one use of this insight, I want to give an example of using this insight. If your company has a larger audience that are not newbies, you might want to think about how you want to invest more for those experienced or tenured employees. Many times, we quickly default to investing almost everything into onboarding. However, you do have a significant number of your audience that are seeking things for learning and gaining knowledge that you might be missing. All right, next step, interview stakeholders. So once you have a better understanding of who your audience is, you'll want to interview your stakeholders. So what are the business problems that need to be solved? Is it productivity and efficiency? Is it accuracy? Is it for adapting a new workflow or a tool? Is it to reduce support or reduce the kind of overhead of people asking so many questions in Slack and Jira? What kind of knowledge gaps do they observe from their vantage point? And what performance and productivity expectations do they have for your audience? So that's interviewing stakeholders. Even more important is to interview different audience segments. So we recently spoke about analyzing and segmenting your audience. Now here you can actually start using that data. So now that you have a better understanding of what your business expectations are, your next step is to interview as much of a diverse set of folks as you can. So a lot of folks quickly jump immediately into creating a survey. However, you might not necessarily know what type of questions to ask in your survey. So let's identify folks from different levels, different cohorts, different teams, tenure, location. If your program's about adapting to a new tool, you might want to interview some of those early adopters to see what their experiences are. And so, here are some example questions that you might want to ask. Try to understand what the biggest pain points and friction points are. One thing that I like asking is, what leads you to interruptions? So what stops you from continually doing your job so that you'll need to look something up or ask something from someone? And as you begin interviewing your first interviewees, you might realize you might need to add new questions or remove questions that might not be very helpful. Optionally, some of these questions could also lead to a needs assessment. So you can also start figuring out whether or not training will actually help solve the problem. Because once you understand some of the root causes of some of this pain that your engineers or employees are feeling, it might not be because of a lack of knowledge. It might be because a process or workflow is not standardized, or it might be because something's broken. And those things might prevent you from actually being successful in what you're trying to do. All right, next step, which is crafting and distributing a survey. So as you start interviewing different sources, patterns will start to emerge. And you're just going to naturally form assumptions based on these patterns. This will be a good opportunity to validate those assumptions by sending out a survey to a larger set within your audience. Now you're going to start sending out these surveys, validate your assumptions. You'll start receiving results of your survey. And the data you'll get back will be incredibly noisy, and I'll talk about the noise a little later, but this is a good opportunity to start filtering your data or slicing your data based on the segments that we spoke about before. So let's, cohorts. How does the data change between cohorts, or tenure, or, organization or team level? Now you can start seeing how this differentiates and start seeing hot spots of where to focus some of your energy on. All right. Okay. Now we get into the fun stuff. Now that we have some contextual information through interviewing and through surveys, it's a good time to start beginning to think about metrics. A great way to begin defining metrics is by following the goals, signals, metrics framework, which is a popular framework that is used in product development and user experience. If you Google it, there's going to be a lot of resources out there. One that I really suggest, one that I enjoy reading, Atlassian actually has a great overview of it. So if you want to Google goals, signals, metrics, look out for the Atlassian page, and it'll provide you a really great overview of this framework. And this is the same framework that we used at LinkedIn to define metrics, not only for our learning and knowledge sharing solutions, but also, even for our engineering productivity and efficiency metrics. Okay, so I'll go through each of them, goals, signals, and metrics. So goals, what is the business problem that, what is the business problem that needs to be solved? All right, signal, what evidence is needed to know you're on the right path? And I'll have some examples in the next slide for you, right? And metrics is really, how do you start quantifying your signal through like two or more measures? By measure, I mean, think about what you're measuring and time or some other dimension. It's usually a metric, which is two or more measures, right? This could be done through brainstorming with your team members or stakeholders. But what's good is that it helps you keep focused on the actual business problem you're trying to solve and how success might look like. So a few things to think about when you're defining metrics, all right? Every metric needs to be actionable. So when you define your metrics, you should be able to predict what are the next steps to take if the metrics might not be going in the right path. All right. These metrics can be both subjective and objective. So as I mentioned before, it's totally fine to distribute surveys. And, I know a lot of people kind of dread surveys, and, survey fatigue is a real thing. There might be good opportunities to partner with other teams to consolidate surveys so that, your audience receives them less frequently. But surveys is a completely valid form of empirical data. Metrics need to be consistent and repeatable, so they are never one and done. So a lot of sometimes we want to capture some baseline data, send out surveys, and we never send out surveys again to see if things have actually gotten better. But you would like to, what you might like to do is collect your metrics on a recurring basis to understand whether or not you're reaching towards your goal. For example, if you send out a survey to gather some metrics, you might need to send that survey out maybe once a month or once a quarter. Or for things like onboarding, make sure those surveys are always sent out at the same period of time. So for example, if you're measuring whether or not people are actually applying what they've learned to their job, if you always send it out 30 or 45 or 60 or 90 days after that training, always send it out around that right time. And do not change your questions with each survey you sent out. Otherwise, the respondents might interpret it in a different way, and it could compromise what you're actually measuring. Oh, and one last thing. Don't make your surveys anonymous, because if you do make your surveys anonymous, you are preventing yourself from segmenting the data in order to provide insights. All right. Cool. So here are some examples of how goals, signals, metrics might apply. You know, I'm starting with really tactical ones, and then, you know, some of the later examples are more strategic. And like I said, these are not silver bullet metrics. These might not apply to your company. These are just completely hypothetical. So for example, you know, if your goal is to increase usage of new training videos, signal would be, you know, number of people watching those videos, and, you know, a metric can be unique viewers per month. I'm going to jump down. You know, one is improve understanding of how to actually push code at your company. And so the signal here is, you know, developers actually publishing code quicker. You know, a good metric for this might be, you know, time to first commit per month. You know, reduce confusion of a new workflow or tool. Signal for this might be less people actually asking questions. A good metric for this might be, you know, measuring internal support tickets, or empirically observing the volume of Slack questions that there are. And, you know, one final thing, improved knowledge of our CI/CD process. You know, a signal for this is less time it takes for a developer to go everything from code checkout all the way to release or deployment. You might want to look at something like cycle time per month. One thing to note, the more strategic your metric is, there might be a lot of variables that might affect it as well, more than just learning or documentation. These things might be like other types of friction, such as bad tooling, bad code. So those are considerations you'll need if you are doing things such as systems level objective metrics. All right. Okay. I went through a lot right now. So any questions we have so far before I move on? And it looks like we only have 12 minutes left. So I'm going to try to jump quickly through the next few steps.
Yeah, no real questions so far. Lots of good conversations though. So in the sidebar.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. All right. So once you collect your data for your metrics, it'll be incredibly noisy. Now is a good time to turn your data into real insights. So you'll need to aggregate all of your data using the segments we defined earlier. Segments such as cohort, tenure, org, location. You know, you can use these as dimensions or filters to reduce this noise and provide more fidelity in your insights. They'll actually start creating hotspots so that you'll know where to zoom in and what, you know, certain type of audience you might want to focus on. To get this data, you'll need to join your results with HR data to get the right dimensions for things like tenure, team, or location. Tools like Tableau or Power BI are perfect for this. If you have the opportunity and funding to actually start collecting systems level metrics, that too will be incredibly noisy, and there will be tons of outliers that will compromise your aggregation. And for that reason, I don't suggest aggregating using things like mean, but rather 50th and 90th percentile. So P50, P90. 50th percentile will give you a good typical measure of your audience, while 90 percentile could provide you with what the overall outliers look like. Luckily, calculating things like P50, P90, and other percentiles comes with Tableau right out of the box. So you don't have to put too much effort into calculating that yourself. All right, here's an example. If you're trying to measure whether or not your employees are satisfied with the learning that they received, here's one way you can actually start aggregating the data that you receive. This is completely general hypothetical data. This is not specific to anything. But here you see CSAT. And, if we slice the CSAT by tenure or by cohort, you'll be able to see where a lot of the friction is. And here for, newbies and somewhat more experienced employees are kind of the most frustrated, and that's something you might want to zoom in on. Or, here looks like back-end developers or SREs and AI engineers. They have a certain level of frustration, so you might want to investigate that a little bit more. Here's another example with like time to first commit. You can see here, back-end devs seem to be struggling as far as, taking some time to actually start committing code. And if you start looking at the P90, this is a good reason why I don't recommend mean, because it really compromises what you're trying to look for. So here, for example, your infra developers might be having really big outliers, but you really want to focus on what the experience is for the majority of your audience. Okay, because of time, I'm going to skip the next few things, so we have time for one or two more questions. All right, next steps. You've created your data. You've collected your data, you aggregated and reported your data. What are your next steps? You'll need to start coming up with baselines. And so, you could get good baselines from the reports that you've created. And when you have the baseline, where do you go from here? The next step is to continue with the scientific method. So based on the evidence that you have, you can now easily form data-driven hypothesis to solve the problem. So for example, your hypothesis doesn't have to be hand-wavy. You can actually say things like, if you implement this learning or knowledge solution, this metric will go up by X%. And then after implementation, start measuring from a repeatable perspective. You'll actually know if things move or not. And you want to hold yourself and your team accountable for these metrics. One thing I highly suggest is, if you have a weekly team meeting, review your metrics as part of your weekly agenda. And you'll also, reviewing the metrics each week really initiates some really good conversations with your team, especially if things aren't going as expected. You'll want to review your metrics monthly or quarterly with your leadership. For larger scope problems, one thing I highly recommend is to follow the agile process for a small segment of your audience, so that your iterations for your program are a lot easier to manage and gives you space to fail quickly. And once you find success, once you experiment and find the right thing to do that drives the metrics the way that you want to, now you can replicate that across other segments and try to scale that to a broader audience. Excuse me. All right, so let's review. One, you're going to want to analyze your audience. So partner with HR, get the data you need, segment your audience. interview stakeholders to understand what their expectations are, interview your audience in different segments to understand what their pain points and friction points are, validate the patterns that you see by creating and delivering a survey, use that data to actually start defining metrics using the goals, signals, metrics framework, and then start collecting and aggregating some of that data, either, subjectively through surveys or objectively through systems. And that's all. Looks like I'm ending right on time.
Perfect timing, Rajon. Awesome. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you. I love the idea of using this scientific method to go beyond just the Kirkpatrick levels. And so there's been a lot of great discussion in the chat. I just wanted to point out that we have a couple more minutes for questions if anybody has anything burning. Additionally, we also have a TechKnowCon Slack channel, so please join that. Rajon is there all the time. At least that's my experience. And so you can also ask questions asynchronously via Slack. With that, any other questions, comments, or anything else? Rajon, while we're here, we have a couple more minutes. There's also Andrew had a question about how often do you do this? Is this a continuous flow of data back to you, or is this you have to pull it every once in a while when you have some initiatives such as refreshing onboarding?
It really depends what kind of system you're using. Survey data is staggered. So it's not continuous, but you'll need to make a conscious effort to ensure that it's delivered in a consistent recurrence. As far as system level data, it really depends on the system. Some systems provide you a stream of data that you'll need to query, while other systems you'll need to pull the data ad hoc. So hard to answer that question, but hopefully that's in the right direction. I saw that Greg has his hand up.
Yeah. Greg, did you want to speak up?
Yeah, sure. Hey, Rajon. Greg here.
Good seeing you again, Greg. Me and Greg used to work together.
We did. I loved working with you at LinkedIn, Rajon. Thanks for the talk today. Could you talk briefly about change management? Let's say you have your course all hammered out, students are taking it, they're loving it. And then of course, our systems change a lot, over time. How often do you go revisit the analytics to make sure that what you started off with is still heading down the same path that it should be, even though the systems are changing underneath your feet? I don't know if that makes sense, but
yep.
Change management,
yeah. So that is a specific level of fidelity that you're looking in at your data. And so, if you're looking for things like, the metrics that measures if things have been applied, or even general, are they satisfied with the overall training that your company provides? I would say that, to ask that question in such a general way that gives you signal whether or not what you're giving them is actually useful, regardless of what specific tool that they're learning is.
Thanks.
There were a couple more questions from Paul and Kelly, but I'm just checking up on times. Do we want to move that to a Slack? Would that make sense, or is this something that you want to answer right now? All right, maybe we should just move it to Slack, since I know that Paul is there, and Kelly, I'm not sure if you are, but please join Slack and we can continue the conversation there. Obviously, very interesting conversation, hard problem to solve, and thank you, Rajon, for just taking us through all this. Super grateful for that.
Thanks so much, everyone. Talk to you in Slack.
Yeah.